Look, I don't know who sent you down here, sweetheart, but this is the final qualification for the Inter-Service Long-Range Championships. This isn't some weekend plinking club for hobbyists. We use real rifles here, not toys. Why don't you go find the admin office? I'm sure they have some filing you can do. The crowd of seasoned marksmen, a sea of hardened faces in desert tan uniforms, rippled with chuckles and smirks. The insult, delivered by the barrel-chested gunnery Sergeant Miller, hung in the dry, shimmering heat of the desert air, thick and oily. He stood with his hands on his hips, a caricature of authority, his voice a gravelly boom that demanded attention. He was the gatekeeper of this sacred ground, a 1,000-meter range carved into the unforgiving landscape of the training center, and he clearly believed he was culling the unworthy from the herd. The woman he addressed did not flinch. She did not sigh. She did not offer a retort or even meet his condescending gaze. Instead, her focus remained entirely on the task at hand. Her movements were a study in fluid economy, a silent ballet of practiced precision. She was of average height, with a wiry frame that seemed almost lost inside her neatly tailored fatigues. Her face, devoid of makeup and framed by a severe, practical bun of dark hair, was a mask of serene neutrality. Her hands, however, were what drew the eye. They were not delicate. They were tools, honed and steady, as they methodically unlatched the heavy-duty rifle case. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each click of a latch, each soft slide of high-density foam, was deliberate and purposeful. She lifted the weapon from its case with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. It was an M210, but heavily customized. The stock was worn smooth in places, molded by countless hours of contact with her shoulder and cheek. The optics were a complex array of lenses and dials that spoke of a massive investment and an even greater level of expertise. She ignored the lingering laughter, the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes. For her, the world had shrunk to the familiar weight of the rifle, the cool steel of the bolt, and the precise, mechanical symphony of her preparation. The noise was irrelevant. The opinions were static. The mission was all that mattered. But from the observation tower 50 yards behind the firing line, Colonel Vance, the base commander, lowered his binoculars. He wasn't looking at the loud gunnery sergeant or the amused crowd. He was looking at her stance. He saw the way she planted her feet, the subtle distribution of her weight, the way her shoulders relaxed into a posture that was both impossibly still and coiled with potential energy. It was a stance he had seen only once before, a lifetime ago, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world where legends were born in blood and shadow. He saw the quiet professionalism that screamed louder than any boast. He saw the ghost of a ghost. If you believe competence is the only voice that matters, type respect below. The gunnery sergeant, emboldened by her silence, which he mistook for meekness, continued his tirade. He walked down the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, his voice carrying over the rising wind. Listen up, shooters. Today we separate the men from the boys, and apparently the girls who got lost on their way to the PX. The challenge is simple. One shot, cold bore. Target is a standard 10-inch steel plate at 1,200 meters. The wind is gusting from 3 o'clock, variable from 10 to 15 miles per hour. Mirage is a nightmare today. Anyone who can't read that wind might as well pack it up now and save us all the time and ammunition. He paused dramatically, letting his gaze sweep over the competitors before it landed, once again, on the silent woman. 1,200 meters is a long way. It requires skill. It requires discipline. It requires an understanding of ballistics that you don't get from reading a manual. You have to feel it. It's an art, not a science, he smirked, gesturing vaguely in her direction. Some people just don't have the instinct for it. The isolation was palpable. The other shooters, men who had served for years and considered themselves experts, subtly shifted their weight, creating a physical and psychological distance between themselves and her. They were a pack, and she was the outsider. Her quiet, unassuming presence was a disruption to their established hierarchy. They saw her plain uniform, devoid of the flashy unit patches and extra gear that many of them sported. They saw her lack of reaction, her utter calm, and interpreted it as a lack of experience, an ignorance of the gravity of the situation. They did not see the meticulous way she laid out her shooting mat, aligning it perfectly with the target. They did not notice how she produced a kestrel wind meter, held it aloft for precisely 60 seconds, and then put it away, her eyes scanning the subtle rustle of distant vegetation, reading the invisible currents of the air like a sailor reads the sea. Her silence was a canvas onto which they all projected their own assumptions, their own biases, their own insecurities. To them, she was an anomaly, an error to be corrected and dismissed. To her, they were simply part of the landscape, elements to be noted and disregarded, no different from the wind or the sun. Her entire being was focused inward, a deep, meditative state of preparation. She cleaned the lens of her scope with a soft cloth, her breathing slow and rhythmic, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The world of insults and egos and posturing faded into a dull, distant hum. There was only the rifle, the target, and the complex, beautiful problem of the space between them. She was not preparing to compete. She was preparing to work. And her work was a language spoken in silence and precision, a language that everyone on that range was about to learn. The first shooter, a cocky Marine sergeant with a chest full of ribbons, stepped up to the line. He went through his routine with a flourish, adjusting his gear with exaggerated movements, talking to his spotter in a loud, confident voice. He settled in, took his shot, and the sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the range. A few seconds later, a puff of dust erupted a full 2 feet to the left of the steel plate. The wind had betrayed him. A collective groan went through the crowd. The second shooter, an Army Ranger, fared no better, his shot going high and right. The third, a seasoned Navy SEAL, came closer, but his bullet skipped off the dirt just below the target. One by one, the best marksmen the services had to offer were humbled by the treacherous conditions. The wind was a fickle beast, a ghost that toyed with their calculations. Gunnery Sergeant Miller's expression soured. His competition was turning into an embarrassment. His gaze fell upon the woman, who was next in line. "All right, let's get this over with," he grumbled, his voice dripping with disdain. "Try not to hit the observation tower." She moved to the firing position with the same unhurried grace she had displayed all morning. There was no ceremony, no dramatic pause. She settled onto the mat, her body becoming one with the earth. She slid the bolt forward, chambering a single, gleaming cartridge. Her "I found the scope," and the world beyond vanished. For her, there was only the circular image, shimmering with heat haze, the distant black speck of the target hanging in a sea of brown. She did not consult a dope card. She did not make any last-second adjustments to her scope. Her hands rested gently on the weapon, her trigger finger hovering, not touching. Her breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. One breath in, a long, slow breath out, releasing all tension. In the deafening silence that followed, a stillness settled over her. It was the calm at the center of a storm. She was not aiming at a target. She was connecting 2 points in space and time. The rifle was merely an extension of her will, a conduit for her focus. The wind was not an obstacle. It was a factor, a variable in a complex equation she had already solved in her mind. She saw the currents, the eddies, the brief lulls. She waited. The crowd shuffled impatiently. Miller tapped his foot, and then, in a moment of absolute stillness between gusts, she pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting recoil. The sound was not a loud crack, but a deep, resonant thump, a testament to the heavy match-grade round. For 3 impossibly long seconds, the only sound was the fading echo of the shot and the whisper of the desert wind. Time seemed to stretch and warp. All eyes were fixed on the distant hillside, waiting for the telltale puff of dust that would signal another miss. But the dust never came. Instead, a clear, high-pitched ping rang through the air, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. It was unmistakable. It was perfect, a direct hit. The sound was followed by a profound, absolute silence. The smirks and chuckles were gone, wiped from the faces of the assembled shooters as if by a physical blow. Zhao Hong's eyes widened in disbelief. They stared at the target, then back at the woman, then back at the target, as if trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. The cocky Marine sergeant who had missed so badly slowly shook his head. The seasoned SEAL just stared, his own formidable skill suddenly feeling inadequate. They had all been defeated by the conditions, undone by the ghost of the wind. She had made it look effortless. She had made it look simple. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stood frozen, his face a mask of utter shock. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish out of water. The words, "No way," and "That's not possible," formed on his lips but made no sound. His entire framework of judgment, his carefully constructed hierarchy of skill and experience, had been shattered by a single, perfectly placed piece of metal. He had built his reputation on being able to size up a shooter, on understanding the art of the long-range shot. In one moment, she had exposed his loud confidence as nothing more than ignorant pride. She, in her quiet way, had not just hit a target. She had dismantled his entire worldview. While the others were lost in their shock, she was already working. She pulled the bolt back, the spent casing ejecting in a graceful arc and landing softly on her mat. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Miller. She did not smile or show any sign of triumph. She simply began the methodical process of cleaning her rifle, her movements just as calm and precise as they had been before the shot. The act of victory was, to her, no different than the act of preparation. It was simply the next step in a process. The deafening silence was her validation, more powerful than any cheer or applause. It was the sound of respect being earned, not demanded. From the observation tower, Colonel Vance spoke into his radio, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, report to the tower. Now the command crackled over the rangemaster's handheld radio, breaking the spell of silence. Miller jumped as if struck by lightning. He fumbled with his radio, stammering a "yes, sir," before casting one last, bewildered look at the woman and jogging towards the tower stairs. The other shooters began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices low and filled with a newfound awe. "Who is she?" one asked. "I've never seen a shot like that." "Not in these conditions," another whispered. Her anonymity, which had once bred their contempt, now fueled their fascination. She had become a mystery, a legend born in the space of 3 seconds. As Miller ascended the metal stairs, Colonel Vance turned to his aide, a young captain. "Give me the personnel file for the shooter at Lane 7. Now, the captain, sensing the urgency and gravity in the colonel's tone, quickly tapped on a ruggedized military tablet. He typed in the roster number from the sign-in sheet. A few seconds later, a file appeared on the screen. The captain's eyes went wide. He swallowed hard and turned the tablet towards the colonel. Vance didn't even need to look at it. He already knew. But the confirmation was necessary for what was to come. He took the tablet as Miller arrived at the top of the stairs, out of breath and looking unnerved. "Gunny," Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his rank. "You had some things to say about that shooter," Miller paled. "Sir, I was just trying to maintain standards. I didn't mean any disrespect. You were loud," Vance stated simply. "You made assumptions. You judged a book by its cover. A mistake I've seen cost good men their lives." He held up the tablet, the screen glowing in the dim light of the tower's interior. "You think you know what a professional looks like, Gunny? You think it's about how loud they talk or how many patches they wear on their sleeve. You are about to receive an education." Vance's finger swiped across the screen, bringing up the woman's service record. He began to read aloud, his voice clear and steady, each word a hammer blow against Miller's arrogance. The sound carried down to the now silent firing line as every shooter strained to hear. It was the beginning of the reveal, the moment where silence would finally be given a name and a history. "Name, Rostova Eva. Rank, Master Sergeant," Colonel Vance began, his voice cutting through the air. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd below. Master Sergeant was a senior NCO rank, a position of significant experience and respect, far above the junior status they had all assumed. Miller's face tightened. He had just publicly berated as senior NCO. But Vance was just getting started. Unit classification, Tier 1 Special Missions Unit. Redacted. The murmurs below ceased instantly, replaced by a stunned intake of breath. Tier 1, the very pinnacle of the special operations world. These were the units that didn't officially exist, the operators whose missions were never acknowledged. They were the ghosts, the quiet professionals who handled the nation's most sensitive and dangerous tasks. Vance continued, his voice like a judge reading a verdict. Combat déploiement, 12. All classified. Combat hours, over 4,000. Also classified. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable. 12 deployments meant a career spent almost entirely in war zones, in the shadows. 4,000 combat hours was a lifetime under fire. Primary military occupational specialty, 18Z, Special Forces Operations Sergeant. Secondary specialty, Senior Sniper, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Level 1 instructor. This explained everything and nothing. It explained the impossible skill, the inhuman calm. But it deepened the mystery of who she was. She wasn't just a sniper. She was the one who taught the best snipers in the world. Vance looked directly at Miller, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Awards and decorations, Silver Star. Bronze Star with V4 Valor, 4 oak leaf clusters. Purple Heart, 3 oak leaf clusters. Distinguished Marksman Badge. And Vance paused for emphasis. The Presidential Unit Citation for Operation Nightfall, the name of the operation, though classified, was whispered about in the barracks like a ghost story. It was a legendary, near-suicidal mission that had turned the tide in a forgotten conflict. The official story was that a handful of operators had held off an entire enemy battalion for 3 days until reinforcements could arrive. The reality was even more incredible, and she had been there. Vance lowered the tablet. He looked down at the range, where Master Sergeant Rostova was still methodically packing her gear, oblivious or indifferent to the revelation of her own legend. Then, in a gesture that sent a shockwave of understanding through every person watching, Colonel Vance, a full-bird colonel and the commander of the entire base, drew himself to attention. He faced the firing line, faced her, and rendered a slow, perfect, formal salute. It was the ultimate sign of respect, a high-ranking officer acknowledging a peer, a legend, regardless of the insignia on her collar. It was a public and profound apology for the ignorance she had endured. It was validation, delivered with the finality of a court-martial. The image of the colonel saluting the unassuming master sergeant was burned into the memory of every person on that range. It was a moment of profound institutional correction. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of reverence. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stood beside the colonel, utterly defeated. The foundation of his authority, built on volume and bluster, had crumbled to dust. He looked down at his own hands, then at the woman below, and for the first time, he saw her not as an anomaly, but as the standard, a standard he had failed to recognize. Colonel Vance finally lowered his salute and turned to Miller. His voice was low, meant only for the gunnery sergeant. Her call sign on Operation Nightfall was Echo, because after she took a shot, the only thing you heard was the echo of the round, followed by silence. She and one spotter held the northern pass at Alcadra for 72 hours against 300 enemy fighters. The official report states she confirmed 157 kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. They called her the ghost of Alcadra. She doesn't wear the medals, Gunny, because for people like her, the mission is the only reward. Respect is not about what you wear on your chest. It's about what you can do when everything is on the line. Do you understand me? Miller could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He understood. He had insulted not just a fellow service member, but a living legend. He had tried to humiliate a woman whose quiet competence had saved countless American lives. The weight of his ignorance pressed down on him, a physical and crushing burden. Down on the line, the story was already beginning to spread, whispered from one shooter to another. Did you hear? Tier 1 inch, the ghost of Alcadra, 157 confirmed. The words flew like sparks, igniting a fire of awe and respect. The men who had laughed at her now looked at her with a mixture of shame and admiration. They watched as she finished packing her rifle, her movements still unhurried, still precise. She snapped the case shut, stood up, and for the first time, she looked up toward the observation tower. Her eyes met Colonel Vance's. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a thank you. It was a simple recognition between two professionals who understood the same silent language. Then, she turned and began to walk away, her gear slung over her shoulder, just another soldier heading off the range. She didn't want the attention, the accolades. The demonstration was over. The point had been made. Her work was done. The story of Master Sergeant Rostova's shot and the colonel's salute did not stay on the range. It spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, the tale was being recounted in the chow hall, each retelling adding a little more detail, a little more myth. By evening, it was the talk of every barracks on base. The impossible 1,200-meter cold bore shot in a gusting wind became the central pillar of the legend. Gunnery Sergeant Miller's public humiliation became the cautionary tale that framed it. The narrative was simple, powerful, and deeply satisfying. Quiet competence had triumphed over loud arrogance. The story transcended gossip. It became a teaching moment. Instructors at the sniper school started using it as an example. "You think you're good?" they'd ask a cocky student. "Let me tell you about the ghost of Alcadra." The firing lane she had used, Lane 7, was unofficially renamed the Ghost's Perch. A few days later, someone used a paint pen to stencil a small, faint E for echo on the concrete firing block. It became a point of pride for shooters to be assigned to that lane, a silent reminder of the standard they were all chasing. Gunnery Sergeant Miller was not formally reprimanded, but his punishment was far more effective. He had lost the currency of his authority, the respect of his peers. He became quieter, more thoughtful. The booming, arrogant rangemaster was replaced by a more subdued, observant instructor. A week after the incident, he saw Master Sergeant Rostova walking across the main parade ground. He changed his direction to intercept her. He stood before her, his posture stiff, his face etched with humility. "Master Sergeant," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to apologize for my conduct on the range. There's no excuse for it. I was unprofessional. I was wrong." Rostova stopped and looked at him. Her expression was neutral, not angry, not forgiving, simply observant. She listened to his entire, fumbling apology without interruption. When he was finished, a long silence stretched between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and even. "The wind was the challenge, Gunny. Not me." She gave another one of her small, precise nods. "Do your job." And with that, she continued on her way. It was not forgiveness, but it was something more valuable, a professional directive. An acknowledgement that the past was irrelevant and the only thing that mattered was future performance. For Miller, it was a lifeline. He had not been dismissed, but challenged to be better. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The quiet professional had taught him more with 5 words than he had learned in 20 years of service. The legacy of that day continued to grow, taking on a life of its own. The spent brass casing from Rostova's shot, which she had left behind on her mat, was picked up by one of the younger shooters. He took it to the base machine shop, where it was polished and mounted on a small, hand-carved wooden plaque. Below it, a small brass plate was engraved with the date, the distance, and a simple, powerful inscription. "Competence is the only voice." The plaque was hung on the wall of the sniper school's main classroom, right next to the portraits of decorated war heroes. It became a touchstone for new students, a physical artifact of the living legend who had walked among them. The story became a filter for the culture of the institution itself. It was a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that strength was synonymous with bravado. It championed the quiet, methodical, and often unseen work that formed the true backbone of the military. Rostova herself remained an enigma. She was occasionally seen on base, always moving with purpose, always focused on her next task. She never spoke of the incident on the range. When younger soldiers, emboldened by the legend, would approach her with questions, she would politely deflect, turning the conversation back to their own training. "Focus on your breathing," she would advise a struggling marksman. "Control the variables you can control. Ignore the ones you can't." Her humility was as profound as her skill. She did not see herself as a hero or a legend. She saw herself as a professional with a job to do. Her identity was not tied to her reputation, but to the execution of her duty. This, more than the impossible shot, was her greatest lesson. She taught that true confidence is silent. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need external validation. It is proven, not proclaimed. The ripple effects were felt even in the highest echelons. Colonel Vance used the incident in his officer training briefs as a case study in leadership and the danger of assumptions. Look for the quiet ones, he would tell his young lieutenants. The ones who listen more than they talk. The ones who are focused on the work, not the credit. They are your most valuable assets. Do not let your ego blind you to their worth. The story of Master Sergeant Rostova became more than just a story. It became doctrine. It was a parable about the soul of the professional warrior, a reminder that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, and that true strength lies in the calm, quiet mastery of one's craft. A year passed. The seasons changed in the high desert, but the legend of the Ghost's Perch remained. New recruits arriving at the training center were told the story on their first day, their eyes wide as they looked at the simple plaque in the classroom. Gunnery Sergeant Miller was still the range master, but he was a different man. He treated every shooter, regardless of rank, gender, or appearance, with the same level of professional respect. He had learned, in the most humbling way possible, that greatness wore many disguises. His own competence as an instructor had grown tenfold because he now focused on teaching the skill, not on asserting his own authority. He had learned to listen, to observe, to see the potential in the quiet ones. One afternoon, Colonel Vance was observing a new class of sniper candidates. They were struggling with the same windy conditions that had been present a year ago. Frustration was mounting. Vance watched as Miller walked down the line, stopping behind a young, nervous-looking soldier who had missed her last 3 shots. Instead of yelling, Miller knelt beside her. "What's the wind telling you?" he asked quietly. "I don't know, Gunny," she stammered. "It keeps changing." Miller didn't give her the answer. He pointed to a small bush in the distance. "Watch that bush. Watch the mirage. Don't just look, see? Your rifle knows what to do. You just have to listen to what the world is telling you." He was quoting, almost word for word, something Master Sergeant Rostova had told him in a brief professional conversation months later. He was passing on the wisdom. He was continuing the legacy. Vance smiled. The lesson had been learned. The culture was changing. Master Sergeant Rostova was no longer on the base. She had moved on to her next assignment, to another classified location to solve another impossible problem. She left behind no statues, no official commendations for that day. But her legacy was not in plaques or stories. It was in the actions of those she had influenced. It was in a gunnery sergeant teaching with patience instead of pride. It was in a young soldier learning to trust her own quiet observation. It was in a colonel reminding his officers to value competence over charisma. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in your absence. It's what continues forward in the actions of others. It is the quiet, persistent echo of a standard well set, a lesson well learned. It is the proof that one person, through the silent demonstration of pure, undeniable skill, can change the world around them, not by raising their voice, but by elevating the very definition of respect. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.